Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Royal Society, the UK's National Academy of Science. My name's Vicky Bruce. I'm one of the Vice Presidents of the British Academy, and this is a joint event between the British Academy and the Royal Society. And I'm Vice President for Public Engagement, and tonight's event is exactly the kind of event that we are trying to do more of as part of our public outreach. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I just have to run through some housekeeping announcements, so I get the housekeeping job. Firstly, can I ask people to ensure not that your mobile phones are switched off, but they're switched to silent, because we do encourage those that wish to tweet during the event. But please make sure they're on silent. Secondly, there are no planned fire evacuations this evening, so in the event of an alarm going off, it probably means something serious and we will have to leave the building. So you would need to evacuate through fire exits, which are at the front, middle and rear of the room. And I'm not going to do the airline demonstrations of where those are, and I'm not sure we've got lights guiding you to them. But anyway, there are live subtitles provided throughout the event. These are provided for the benefit of people who might find it difficult to hear what's said. I believe that the people who are going to be using those subtitles know to sit on this side of the room and will be able to see the subtitles. I hope so anyway. And I should also tell you that this evening's event is being webcast live and recorded for the Society's archives. Now, on to the event proper. I'm really delighted to be introducing this event. It's been, as I said, been organised jointly by the Royal Society and the British Academy as part of their respective public programmes. Now, if you want to find out more about those programmes, please do pick up some of the material and leaflets from outside. The Royal Society, as we saw on the slides shown earlier, was founded in 1660. The oldest scientific academy in continuous existence, and aims to recognise, promote and support excellence in science. The British Academy is the UK's national body for the humanities and social sciences. The Academy aims to inspire, recognise and support high achievement in the humanities and social sciences throughout the UK and internationally. Now, turning to tonight's speakers. The host for tonight's event is Zainab Badawi. Zainab has a very distinguished record as a journalist and television presenter, formerly for the ITV and now for the BBC, and is currently chair of the Council of the Royal African Society. Talking with Zainab tonight is Professor Richard Leakey. Richard Leakey is a Kenyan paleoanthropologist, conservationist and public figure. In the 1960s, Richard led multiple successful expeditions to the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya, finding Stone Age tools, skulls, and the remains of early humans. Among the discoveries was Turkana Boy, a near-complete skeleton of a 1.5 million year old Homo erectus, the most complete early human skeleton ever found. Beyond anthropology, and as well as leading the National Museum of Kenya, Richard has been politically influential for many years. His tough anti-corruption and conservation stance as head of the Kenya Wildlife Service took a hard line against poaching, doing much to save elephant and rhino populations. Tonight, I'm sure we will be hearing much more about this remarkable career. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Zainab Badawi and Professor Richard Leakey.
Thank you very much indeed, Vicky. Thank you, Vicky. Good evening, any excellencies who may be in the audience, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure and privilege and honour to be amongst you all today and to be hosting this event. We'll be having a conversation and then there will also be an opportunity for you to ask some questions. You know, we talk so much about globalisation these days, don't we? But in fact, the greatest global superpower of all time is Africa, because it gave rise to the greatest global product, us, human beings, the greatest global species. You're all African exports. Some of us more recent than others, such as myself. I was born under the African sun in the Sudan, but I moved here to the UK when I was 2. But our guest of honor today is somebody who has stayed in his home continent. I'm very glad to hear that. But his reputation, of course, spreads far and wide, far beyond Africa, and we've all benefited tremendously from his life's work. And of course, that is Dr. Richard Leakey, a man I have admired for so many years from afar, but this week I had the wonderful opportunity to meet him up and get close. And Richard, you told me when we had lunch earlier this week that you have a very low boredom threshold, and that explains why he has had more careers in his 7 decades than most people would in, however many lives they may have. And so that explains it. As Vicky said, you've been in a paleoanthropologist, in conservation, and also as a politician, and still going strong. And despite all the trials and tribulations that you have gone through, sometimes he's always smiling, a truly wonderful person. So Richard, you, the Leakey family rather, also are best known for your work in fossils, discovery of fossils which throw light on the origins of humankind, which of course is a subject that fascinates everybody and children and adults alike. So let's start off by talking a little bit about your work in that field. It is now accepted that human beings originated from Africa, but that wasn't always the case, was it? It was a long journey, and in fact, your father and mother, Mary Leakey, an archaeologist, and Louis Leakey, a paleontologist, started work at that time when, the theory was beginning to gain a bit of credence, but there was still a bit of resistance for various reasons.
I think the resistance was very strong, in fact, and in the early part of my father's career, the idea was that if indeed we had evolved, which was first question, the second question was surely not from Africa, and there was a greater preference given to China or Indonesia. This would be better if it was Britain, but Piltdown showed that hadn't been the case. So shifting gear, Asia was a possibility, but Africa, please no. And it's taken a long time. I was just last week in a part of the United States which should be nameless, where absolutely no still persists. But it's still, I think it's a vociferous minority we're now dealing with, and I think the vast majority of people in the, what's the word I would like to use?
A polite one.
In the world that I'm familiar with, except African origin. Whether the African origin is fully accepted in China or Pakistan, it remains to be seen. I have a feeling the message hasn't really been promoted there, and my contacts with Chinese still would prefer a Chinese ancestor, if not for us, for them.
Well, that is because I suppose, most of you will know, but it was Charles Darwin who, particularly as the Ascent of Man in 1871, started looking at the fact that the African gorilla and African chimpanzee, most like us, the chimpanzee in particular, the two not related to each other, but since they were both common only to Africa, he thought that therefore human beings originated in Africa. But it wasn't until 1924 that Raymond Dart in the Kalahari Desert discovered some fossil bones known as tongue child, and that was part of the genre, the Australopithecus africanus genre. But that was the key discovery, wasn't it, Richard, that made people think, or actually it said, look, human origins could have been in Africa, because up until then, hominid fossils had only been found in Asia and Europe. So would that be a fair summary?
The tongue baby or the tongue child was seminal in that it did, for the first time, draw public attention to an alternative to China and Indonesia, or Java as it was then thought of. But the tongue baby was a baby. It wasn't us. And it quickly developed a reputation of simply being an ape man. And it was still considered, even in later years, it didn't in any way deny that the Pithecanthropines of Asia were better candidates. After all, these were just ape men.
Okay, but it's fair enough to start saying that that's when perhaps the focus slightly started shifting. And then again in 1936 with Robert Broom, again in southern Africa, when he discovered fossil bones which gave rise to a group known as Paranthropus. Is that right? Am I getting all these right? Oh my God. Paranthropus. And again, that was a kind of hominid fossil, but it was your parents who in 1959 discovered bones in East Africa in the Olduvai in part of Tanzania. And that was the first time that the story kind of started shifting east. And those bones were known as Zinj, which was part of the Australopithecus group.
Yes.
Do I pass all these tests?
You're doing well so far.
You'll have to have me coming working for you.
But it's
digging up
it's
bones.
still early.
Still early.
I think the Australopithecines, Broom's work, later on Raymond Dart's work, were well established in South Africa. There was no precise knowledge of how long ago they had lived. I think the common sense up until the late 50s was that maximum 500,000 years. And the discovery that my mother made in 1959 of a skull of something called Zinjanthropus, which they named Zinjanthropus, was important not only because it was the first East African find, but it's extremely important because it could be dated. And the first time we had a real date for a human ancestor. And it was dated to 1¾ million years. It was dated not of the bone, but dating of the sediments it was in. And that was a shock to the system to realize that there was at least 3 times more amount of years between us and our fossil ancestors than we had thought. And that started a whole era of research in Eastern Africa, where there were many sites, as we now know, that yielded remains of hominoids and hominids in contexts where dating was possible.
And then, again, another big leaky family discovery in 1961, and that was essentially by your brother Jonathan, who discovered fossils which we think probably are the earliest precursor to us, human beings, Homo habilis. Isn't that right? Handyman, in other words, for those of you who don't speak Latin. Handyman. And so tell us about the significance of that, because that really, Homo habilis is, right up there.
Well, I think what was important was that at the same time that Zinj had lived, and at the same time as some of the Australopithecines had lived in South Africa, there was evidence that somebody or something was making stone implements. And my father was determined to find the author of the stone industries, the archaeology. And when he had only got Zinj, Paranthropus, as generally known, it was thought that he was the tool maker. And so when my older brother Jonathan found a totally different type of early hominid with a much bigger brain case, much smaller teeth and other features that made it clearly not a typical Australopithecine, they decided that this was evidence of 2 lines. And my father then decided that the best candidate for the toolmaker was the specimen that Jonathan had found, and he called it Homo habilis, the handyman. They had bones of the hand, bones of the foot, and certainly the hand was capable of the sort of flexible thumb that gave it precision grip. And that then started this whole discussion about the complexity of lineages at that period in time, and the question then was easier settled, that maybe the Zinj group became extinct, and Homo habilis went on to become other things and ultimately us. Were it so simple?
We're trying to keep it simple because, I'm sure our audience are aware that there are lots and lots of discoveries, but what I will come to the kind of complex lineages and the other branches in a moment, but just to finish what leads to us, Homo sapiens, then in 1964, your father, Louis Leakey, found a skull which he thought belonged to a new group called Homo erectus, and then, of course, your team's major find in 1980, Homo erectus was also in Olduvai, but then in 1984, in Turkana in northern Kenya, not Tanzania anymore, your team discovered what became known as Turkana boy. And he was part of the Homo erectus group, and we think that that again is definitely one of our precursors.
Reflecting on it, I think the way I would see it today and remembering it then was the discovery of the skull by my father in 1964 had firmly placed Homo erectus in Africa. Now, those who wanted an East Asian origin for us and believed Homo erectus led to us said, well, Homo erectus obviously came into Africa, and so that's no problem. By that stage, they could move around, and this was just a migrant into Africa. They still didn't want to see or accept an African origin for large-brained, tool-making ancestors. So later at Lake Turkana, when we found a number of fossils, best epitomized by the Turkana boy, then it is quite clear that Homo erectus in Africa, in East Africa, predated the Homo erectus in China and Indonesia. There are more recently discovered Homo erectuses in Northern Europe, in the state of Georgia, used to be part of the Soviet Union, and those are dated at around 1.7, 1.75 million years. Once again, the issue raised, could Homo erectus have come from the outside into Africa? And although I think the jury may, by some, be considered still out, I think the majority of people accept that the European Homo erectus at 1.7, 1.75 actually was part of an African group that left Africa at that time. And the reason we say that is there seem to be antecedents for Homo erectus in Africa, but nowhere else.
That's very clear, because Homo erectus, we believe, also gave rise to Neanderthal man as one of the groups, possibly, that went into Europe.
Now you're lowering your grades.
Am I? Oh. I thought they did. Because Neanderthal... Okay, let me put it a different way then. I was doing ever so well up until then.
Yes, you were.
Yes. I'm a historian, not a paleontologist. But anyway, let's say then that, as you say, there are these branches and it may have died out. So when we look at the origins of humankind, what would be a good analogy then? To see it as a kind of tree with lots of branches, and some of those branches, or all those branches, led to a dead end. They may have developed, and then there was the one branch that continued and led to us. Or is it more like a river that kind of, branches out into different streams, and then that river, the streams all come together subsequently, and we're made up of little parts of all those streams?
Probably a bit of both.
Right.
I think you're getting into an area...
The analogy is more complex than the answer, isn't it?
We're getting into an area where we still have a lot to learn.
Yeah.
But Neanderthal doesn't come into it until much later.
Right.
I think the Homo erectus material known from 1 million to maybe 500,000 in different parts of the world are beginning to show an increasing set of traits that remind you of more primitive Homo sapiens, such as Neanderthal, but not Neanderthal. You see this predominantly in Southeast Asia and in Europe, and where Neanderthal is obviously characteristic. But as work is now being done in different parts of Africa, at the same period of time, somewhere between 100 and maybe 300,000 years, there are lots of things being discovered now that make it very clear that this move towards us had many threads in the tape, sure. and which dies out, which goes on, which comes together, which is reknitted. Much has to be done. But what I think is important to say is that the early Homo sapiens from Africa are clearly extremely important in understanding the story of the origin of modern humans. There are new techniques, study of DNA, mitochondrial and other, that are beginning to unravel some of this. And I think those of us who work solely with fossils need to be a little more cautious with our prognostications on what something is until we get a little more information on what the DNA may be telling us. Unfortunately, DNA doesn't fossilize very well, and we have very little that goes back.
But we know that DNA shows that our closest relative is the chimpanzee, which, as I said, is closer to us than it is to the gorilla, and we share so much of our DNA with them. And we are essentially a subgroup of the primates, of which there are, 400 species or whatever. And so is it right to say, I mean, there was that find in Chad in West Africa in 2001 of bones, Sahelanthropus, which was thought to perhaps have been a common ancestor to the apes, the chimps or whatever, and us, and that we went our separate ways at about 7 million years ago. Would that be fair?
Well, that's how it's been presented.
Right.
Unfortunately, when you have so little evidence, you've only got one specimen to compare with things that haven't yet been found. Conclusions of that kind are much easier to reach than if you have a lot of other specimens. And I think one of our difficulties is that the work that's being done in Central Africa and Chad at around 7 million years is producing fossils that are certainly reminiscent of later Australopithecines and later what we call hominoids or hominids. But they're just, at the moment, a jaw, parts of a skull, a good skull. It's certainly not us, it's certainly not an Australopithecine. But until you get more of the specimen, more of the body, more of the legs and arms, saying it was upright, may be premature. Saying it had left the trees permanently, it may be very premature. So I think we've got to be very cautious. We can't really go back more than 4.5 million years with any confidence. And there are other fossils from Kenya and slightly younger Ardipithecus in Ethiopia.
I was going to ask you about that, because Lucy, of course, is somebody that a lot of people have heard about, and she was, dated to about 3.2 million years, discovered in the mid-1970s in Ethiopia, and she's part of the Australopithecus afarensis group. And, you know, there was this view when she was discovered, there was so much excitement, this is where it all started and so on. So just put Lucy into some context for us.
Well, it's an interesting and important find. It was, at that time in the study of human origins, it was one of the more complete specimens where we had parts of the head and parts of the body. It was dated around 3 million, give or take. And at that time, nothing else was known to have existed because it either hadn't existed or it hadn't been found. The authors of the paper putting forward Lucy or afarensis as the stem of human origins took a very strong position on that, and being a bit awkward, I and a number of others said, well, maybe not. Maybe there were already two things going on, and maybe you're just hyping this. And in paleoanthropology, hype is quite a useful thing in fundraising. And so,
is it a case of my bones are better than your bones?
Very much my bones are better than yours, and please don't look at mine at the moment. I'll bring them out slowly.
So, okay, so that's put Lucy into some context for us. And then just again, to finish on this issue of recent discoveries, thinking very much of Homo naledi, discovered in this dark chamber in caves 30 miles from Johannesburg quite recently by Lee Berger and his team, where they found 1,550 bones, which looked like they'd been deliberately placed there. And so that's kind of brought up the southern claim because, you know, running the undercurrent to all these fossil discoveries in Africa is you're working in the East and, you know, did it all start in East Africa or did it all start in Southern Africa? And Lee Berger's find, people say, oh, that's brought up the southern claim. So two questions there. What do you think about the discovery there? Too early to tell? Do you think they were deliberately buried? Is the question too long? Sorry, and then the other one was...
The answer may be.
Oh, okay. And then the other one was, you know, what is this kind of, you know, East versus South?
It's chauvinism.
You're the East chauvinist, are you?
I was.
Oh.
No, I think the point that we need to make,
yes.
Zainab, is that Africa at that time was not riven by boundaries. We need to look at Africa at that time, whatever that time was, as stateless and basically a mosaic of environments in which different animals survived, coexisted, and moved into and moved out of. Some of these creatures, after they died, their bones were preserved in either caves or sedimentary traps, and in some circumstances, some of these sites can be dated because whilst they were in the process of burial, volcanic ash settled on the ground from a nearby volcano, and you can date volcanic ash fairly precisely. And so in some cases, you have a dated sequence of deposits in which fossils are found superimposed as you go up the ladder, and you can actually, this is 3 million, or this is 4 million, this is 1 million, this is 2 million. The case isn't so simple in South Africa because if there was volcanic ash, it didn't get into the cave. So the techniques for dating the South African fossils are very, very open to discussion still. And in the case of Naledi, the bones were lying on the surface of a cave floor. So there's nothing left that was covering them. Now, if you read the reports, they were beautifully preserved, complete skeletons. They are not Homo sapiens. And looking at the evidence that has been presented and looking at the papers that have been written and published, there are clearly aspects of those fossils that are very, very reminiscent of us, Homo sapiens. But to claim an age for it when no date has been found is stretching the point.
Right. Okay.
One point. Second point, there's no question that they're a completely new set of fossils representing a species or a stage that we've never seen before. And the one it's most similar to is Floriensis, the hobbit man from the Pacific, which is a tiny little hobbit, which now people say is a small remnant population dwarfed of Homo erectus. Maybe, maybe not, we don't know. But there are little people around, but those were 17,000 years old. Now, if you're going to take skeletons of articulated individuals from fetal ages to fully adult grannies and inter them deep inside a cave, 240 meters from the entrance, and their entrance is so narrow that you really got to get sort of leaf eater model-like people to skimmy their way through these holes with very small buttocks, very small frontals.
Very petite.
Okay, you got very petite, and you have to have light. And there are no mammals that see in absolute dark, as far as we know. Bats got round it in caves where there's no light by developing echolocation. Sea mammals have got at it by the same method, by echolocation. Now, how a primate is going to burrow down without rope and twine and flashlights and take in 15 individuals and leave them lying around on the surface, and bacteria is not going to get at it over the suggested 3 million years, leaves one slightly skeptical.
I think we would agree with that, the way you portrayed it.
And what has worried me, and let me say this and I won't dwell on it anymore, what worries me is that so much hoopla has been made of this in the social media that people now, when it's later, there's backtracking, and people, well, maybe it wasn't like that, maybe it was more conservative interpretation, maybe there was another entrance to the cave. Then many of the naysayers about human evolution, I say, these paleoanthropologists are just dummies. They don't know what they're talking about. Look, they pumped this thing up to the sky, and then one puncture and they all came crashing down. Evolution is rubbish. Evolution is not rubbish. We do know that we are a process of evolution, and we've got very good evidence about our own ancestors.
Sure. But just, I also asked you about the fact that, they said, look, they deliberately buried them, which is something that humans, Homo sapiens, do. So that really raises the question of, what made us Homo sapiens? And just briefly on that, I mean, obviously habitual bipedalism, as you said, with Homo habilis is critical because it leaves the hands free. But just, what else made us human, Homo sapiens, that differentiated us from everything else?
Oh, I would hesitate to it's a sociological question, but what...
You said the large brain and
well,
that
the
kind
large
of thing.
brain is important, but you must know some large brain people who are pretty dumb. I don't think you can take one character and say big heads are human.
You've got a big head.
Yes, I know, and I am human. But I have a few who aren't. They are human, but so I think we've got to be very careful about this. But clearly, cognition, the ability to see things that aren't yet, to put things in time and space, to have the ability to talk about things that were yesterday as well as tomorrow, and to have the facility of using our brain through our hands to fashion things and to fix things and to plan things and to set traps. This is a complex set of characteristics that came through time. As to when they would have given us the ability to aspire to be elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, much later. But are we sure if they had known of the Royal Society, they wouldn't have had that aspiration? Hard to say. But I think we've got to look at this in the longer term. And I think what's very important about this is we are very special in some aspects, but in other aspects we're not at all special. And you know, to draw a hard line is very, very difficult in living creatures, let alone fossil creatures.
Sure. Your mother, Mary Leakey, was an archaeologist, and she spent a great deal of time analysing the tools that were discovered in Africa, in Olduvai especially, you know, and how they were used and what they were used for and so on, which throws light on how early humans or similar, you know, hominids or whatever, conducted their affairs. But a lot of that is extrapolation, isn't it? And
I think what she was trying to do, and what archaeologists at that period, looking at the older than 1 million or older than 500,000, are trying to do, is saying this is how they could have been used, not necessarily how they were used. And I think we often miss that. We also see stone and bone, the only things that preserve, as the sort of ABC of human behavior, not reflecting on the fact that skin and twine and traps and all sorts of other manner of things might well have been part of the life's material culture that we don't record. So I think we've got a very simplistic view of the status of stone tools. I think what is important is to realize stone tools gave access to a meat diet. And a meat diet is important because meat is rich in calories and it comes in reasonably large packages. Even if you don't hunt, you can scavenge. And if you can find a dead animal that somebody else killed and you can cut some meat off it, it's a very valuable commodity because you can take it with you and share it. And so I think meat eating is probably one of the most important things that come along. And I don't think it means we were man the hunter. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking man the scavenger, successful scavenger. And what is interesting is that our colleagues now have got stone implements going back to 3.3 million years. So way back before there were large brains, way back probably before a lot of things we assume make us human, there was an animal or ape, which are of course both, taking big stones and smashing them on other stones, presumably to smash things like tubers and gristle, skins, which our human teeth then couldn't chew. But once you smash it up, you can put it in your mouth and masticate it, and you can swallow it. So I think use of tools in scavenging was probably the beginning, and sooner or later somebody smashed a rock on another rock and cut him or herself and picked up the offending item and said, well, if it can cut me that way, I can use it on something else. And I would have thought it was a serendipitous beginning to tool making.
To
but
becoming
I would
hunters
think
and
earlier
then
than
gatherers.
3.3. I would
Very
think we're going back
interesting,
to 3.5.
Right, so that takes us to the hunters and then the gatherers and then the storers and then the agriculturalists and so on, which leads to us. And of course, we know, as you said, that primates, even today, some of them use tools in a very primitive way. So just to finish off on the origins of humankind, so really, Homo sapiens, we only go back about, what, 75,000 years, modern humans, about 75,000 years?
No.
What, 65?
No.
Gone then?
From the studies of mitochondrial DNA and other DNA work that's been done, everybody living today seems to have a relationship to a population that was confined to Africa some 70 to 80,000 years before the present, maybe slightly less. There was a new...
Isn't that what I just said, about 75,000 years ago? Oh, anyway,
no,
it
you
doesn't
said
matter.
Homo sapiens.
Us, modern people
Fine.
here in this
People
audience,
here,
Royal
yes.
Society, yes.
But strangely, that 100,000 years ago, in fact, almost 200,000 years ago, there were people around in Africa, and probably Ethiopia, Kenya were the best examples, that anatomically would have been entirely acceptable in comparison to anyone in this room. And they clearly have to be anatomically modern humans. But the DNA doesn't suggest there's anything of them in us.
Right.
So what happened more recently for that emigration to take place? We don't know, but something happened. There was clearly massive climate change at the time. The connection between Lake Turkana and the Nile re-established itself. People seem to have got out, but not only out, but south and west. Was it language? Or is it something we still don't understand?
Right. And up until about, what would it be, 20,000, 15,000 years ago, we were all black?
Well, all the suggestions that I hear geneticists talking about is that the color switch was very recently put on, and 10,000, 12,000 probably, and blue eyes probably even more recently. And when you hear of people coming back into Africa, they probably were dark people.
Does put racism in a certain light, doesn't it?
Skin deep.
Doesn't it? Yes. And then just, you said at the beginning how, there's no question, of course, evolution is the thing, but just briefly on the fact that there is resistance, not only in America, as you talked about, where the creationists, are very strong as a force, but even in Africa itself, the irony of this continent being the cradle of humankind, where there are people who, again, subscribe to the creationist concept.
Well, I think what happened, Zainab, is there was always, well, not always, there was traditional religion, which involved origins and involved gods and destiny. How long it goes back, I don't know. But when the slave trade and contact with the northern hemisphere, the Arabs and the Europeans came in, introduced the two major religions that affect Africa today. That was Islam and Christianity. And although we in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa particularly, have fought against colonialism and suggested it's a very evil thing that the white people did to Africa, to a large extent they did it because they wanted to save African souls. Why they would want to do that, I have no idea, but that was the idea behind it. And in the post-colonial freedom-fighting era, nationalist era, we tried to get rid of everything colonial, but the thing we swallowed without trace was Christian belief in Genesis. And it seems to me that the very thing they want to get rid of has taken root deeply. And so there is opposition, but it's opposition coming from missionary education about the Bible. In Islam, you would know from your part of the world, there are also stories that allow evolution, but not of us.
Yes.
And this, I think, is a reflection, perhaps let me stick to the Christian thing, is that subconsciously, if you allow a thought a minute, or for a minute, on the idea that God made us in his image, and then the scientists come along and change the image of us, at what point do you say, wait a minute, we're getting too far from what God should look like when you produce Lucy or an Australopithecus? And I think that's part of the problem. How do you draw the line? What did God create? And obviously the solution, without wishing to offend anybody, he didn't create anything. We created it, God. Much easier to understand. And we'd need to, because God can solve everything. And when we didn't have our own science and our own explanations, you can't live with doubt. And so you give an Almighty the power to explain what's going on. Most times it's wrong. And we haven't completed the circle yet. We will.
So in about 5 minutes or so, because obviously you are, as I said, an eminent in this field of paleontology, you're a paleoanthropologist, but you also, in 1968, you became director of Kenya's National Museums, and then in 1989 you were invited to head the Kenya Wildlife Service. So you moved away from the field work for a while then. But you showed your kind of typical courage, determination, and vision, and not fearing, swimming against the tide in terms of conservation. You were very concerned about elephant and rhino poaching and so on, and of course we see that today with Prince William, for instance, just this week, talking about the fact that, when his daughter reaches 25, people are going to say, well, once upon a time there were elephants that were roaming this earth, and then all the recent cases we've had, of Cecil the lion being killed in Zimbabwe, and then the elephant more recently there. just looking at conservation, how worried are you that that kind of scenario of no elephants or rhinos in 25 years' time could come to pass in Africa?
I think it assumes and presumes that the status of wildlife is set on a trajectory that will always fail. I don't accept that. I think we can understand why there is poaching, which is access through the commodity to fortunes, bad pay for the rangers, poor sentencing of offenders, lack of professionalism in the service. But change those, poaching will stop. Change the attitude to ivory and rhino horn by looking at the market and changing its views, there will be no need for poaching. Poaching is only done because you can make money out of it. And if a ranger can make more money selling one elephant tusk than a year's salary, hell, I would poach. So we have to be realistic. And I don't think the elephants are gone. I think the elephants have taken a beating. They're taking a beating at the moment. The rhino almost gone in most countries. But all these species, if we can keep enough genetic diversity going and we can educate people and give people a better sense of worth, they will come back. And it's not, we don't want to bring our wildlife back so tourists can enjoy it. Of course they should enjoy it. But we want to bring wildlife back so our people can enjoy it. So middle-income people can take their vehicle with their 7 kids and mother-in-law and spend a weekend in the park marveling at these animals. That's why we'll keep it. Not because, with the greatest respect, Prince William thinks we should.
No, I was just saying that, you know, he's the latest person to have talked about this.
No, I know.
But
he's a great guy. Listen, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, he loves the elephants.
No, he loves the elephants. That's
does.
true.
And, you know, but you made a lot of enemies when you were in this field of trying to stop the poaching and so on. And you had, you know, yeah, you had a lot of criticisms and so on. And I know you won't mind my saying this, but in 1993, you had a plane crash because you can fly. And sadly, that led to the amputation of your legs from the knee down. In 93, and sabotage was suspected, although never proved, and I know you feel that perhaps we will never know who may have been responsible for that. But that led to you in 1994 going into politics. You became the leader of the Safina opposition party, and Safina in Swahili means a boat, a bit like Noah's Ark. And in 1997, you got a seat in the opposition in Parliament, so that really, from the mid-90s, was your political career. And then the president at the time, Daniel Arap Moi, did invite you to head this kind of commission whereby you would spearhead the reforms to improve the way the civil service worked in Kenya and also to improve, you know, the governance structures and the institutions and so on. So just really touching on your political career, because you stepped down in 2001 and you said that was the end of my political career. Did you enjoy being a politician? Do you feel that you achieved anything in terms of trying to get the right governance structures in place?
I think we need to put one or two corrections to what you said, very general. I did become head of the public service and in charge of the government, and I did get the authority to appoint a special team of permanent secretaries to reform the government. And during the process of reform, the one objective was to turn the economy around and to get the IMF, World Bank, and other donors back in place. Once we did it, we were less important, and within 2 years, we were gone. Did I enjoy it? I've enjoyed everything I've done. That was tremendous fun. Imagine a whole country. 550,000 people obliged to say, yes, sir. Even if you're completely wrong. What a power, what a power. No, I enjoyed it thoroughly, and we did make a difference. But, you know, I got bored again, I told you.
You told me you got bored again, yes, you got bored again in 2000. Then you went back to your first love, the fossils and so on, and you're now part of course, this wonderful initiative, the Turkana Basin Institute. You're working alongside mostly Stony Brook University in Long Island in the United States, along with other educational institutions, I think Helsinki University and also UCL here in London. And you really are trying to become a kind of, well, you are a magnet for people wanting to work in this field, studying, you know, various aspects of paleontology. And because the Turkana Basin, Lake Turkana on its both sides of its shores, Somalia, Kenya and Ethiopia, you feel is the area which really holds the clues for the origins of humankind, and you really want to get this TBI, Turkana Basin Institute, to develop it even more, attract more support, more funding.
I think the Turkana Basin Institute is an attempt to get researchers to do research where the fossils are being found, to give the local people a stakeholding in it, to give the local people a sense of participation and pride, and to create a first world standard facility in our country that will attract scholars from everywhere and who will come and leave, if not with praise, at least satisfaction. Unfortunately, in our country at the moment, and this is true in many developing countries, governments have many priorities, and putting money into research on human origins and the sciences that aren't developmentally oriented isn't very, very likely. And so the National Museum basically hasn't got the funds to do what needs to be done. And so I thought we'll put in a private sector facility, very ambitious, but it's working. We've raised...
Not for profit.
Not for profit, raised a lot of money. We're getting very good support from many parts of the world.
You don't want to say that. You want to say we haven't got enough funding so people here can go off and help bring more in.
Look at them. They're not going to give me money tonight. So you can read your audience. No, let's not hype that. But it's worked. I mean, it's now become a point of pride in Kenya, particularly amongst the Turkana people, that this is a success story. They own it, they like it, they want it.
And it's very good, and we do hope that people in their own ways will be able to support it. So we have about 20 minutes or so for you to ask some questions to Dr. Leakey. There are a couple of microphones, hand here. Ushers, if you've got, just hand the microphones. Okay, do you mind if we go there because the microphone is close? Keep your questions very, very short. Name an organisation if relevant. Yep, just hand it to the gentleman in the beard. Yep. Stand, please, and project.
Thank you. Should I do something? Yes. You touched a little bit on kind of this mystery of what happened between 200,000 years ago and 80,000 years ago, when we have anatomically modern humans, but we don't kind of have the big exodus, and we don't have like complicated culture. What is Stephen Mython has this idea that what happened was that people got this cognitive fluidity in their minds, where people could suddenly mix different ideas from different domains, and then suddenly you have religion, that sort of thing. What is your best guess about what happened to kind of cause the explosion of culture and this kind of new kind of humans from 80,000 years ago?
The quickest way to answer that is that the fossils that we have thus far from Africa and outside of Africa don't really help understand that question that you put. The archaeology, or the lithics as they like to be referred to, may, but there's as yet not enough lithic material in situ that can be directly attributed to morphology of the hominids that they were being made by or being used by. I think much of sub-Saharan Africa has been completely ignored for the last 100 years in terms of the last 200,000 or 300,000 years. And we now have the opportunity to really start collecting data in a way that was never thought possible. I think we must answer the question that you pose, but I would be loath to attempt it tonight because we have certain facts. There were anatomically modern people, and there are genetic lines to believe that we are all closely related to a much more recent population. What happened and why? Next chapter.
One paleontologist says that when you look at us and how we got here, it's like a massive jigsaw puzzle with 500 pieces. We've got 8 from East Africa and 4 pieces from Southern Africa. That's about it. Oh, no, don't quibble with that. It's okay. I'm just telling you what she said. Patricia Kramer said that, the paleontologist. She's wrong. Goodbye. Patricia. I hope Patricia Kramer is not here with us.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Yeah, debate is good. Yes.
Thank you.
Then this gentleman here.
Would you offer a view as to...
Could you stand? It's easier,
I'd
please.
rather not, sorry.
Oh, sorry, okay.
Would you offer a view as to what Homo naledi actually was? Was it an ancestor? can we say it was an example of symbolic thought? And do you think that Homo habilis was an ancestor?
Well, I think Homo naledi has aspects that certainly would incline me to believe it belongs within the broad concept of that genus Homo. Is everything within the genus ancestral to us? Almost certainly not, and much depends on where you place it in time and how it morphologically integrates with other fossils. My impression is that with the exception of Floriensis, nothing has yet been found that makes a fair comparison. If you don't like to call it Homo's ancestor to Homo sapiens and you want to call it a descendant of Homo erectus, it doesn't really matter. What I would like to say is that if it's 2 or 3 or even 1 million years ago, it has a role in the ancestry of Homo sapiens. But if it turns out to be only 50,000 years old, can it be an ancestor? The answer is, well, it's not 50,000 years. I say, well, maybe it's not, but what is its age? And at the moment, we don't know. The interesting thing is that the majority of the fossils have been demineralized, and they are not well fossilized. Now, is this because of processes after fossilization where they've been decalcified? Or is this because they're fairly recent and have survived 50 to 60,000 years in a sealed cave? These are questions that need answering before I can actually take it any further, for me.
Thank you. Gentleman here, can I see other hands, please? That side or that side? Usher to this person here.
Question.
Two
First.
brief ones then, please, because there are more people.
Did Australopithecine embryo give an adaptive response to vertical body or bipedal walking? And if we implant an chimpanzee embryo in human uterus, and if we get an baby from there, can we have an Australopithecus baby or infant? Thank you.
Well, I didn't follow the entire question, but the part I did get, which I think is relevant, is if a chimpanzee and a human, which are genetically close, had a relationship, could we produce an Australopithecus? Is that the thrust of your question?
Because of that, I want to ask that vertical body and this structure, this posture maybe affect the inside embryo in Australopithecus times. For example, body gets more and more
upright.
vertical,
Yep.
yes, upright. What happened embryo at that time? For example, 2 million, 3 million years ago.
Okay.
Well, I think the very quick answer is that we did become upright probably over the last 4 million years, not 2 million years. There are consequences to being upright and walking on 2 legs. But I don't think it has a particular relevance to the arrival of genus Homo or to Homo sapiens. I think it's one of those incidental events probably related to adaptation for different sources of food. We were large-bodied apes, and I think the feeding strategy was benefited by being upright where you could reach up to things in a more open habitat than if you were a large-bodied ape trying to climb around small trees, which gravity then was probably like today, and the trees break and down you come. So I think it was probably more to do with feeding than to anything else.
Thank you. The lady there, we'll have a female, yeah?
Then we should look on this side.
Yes, it's just I thought, because this is
Yes.
the only lady I see.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm not a paleontologist, so excuse my naivety on this question. Can you use the past to project the future? So can you, in paleontology, perhaps identify which direction human form is going in? I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I had just 2 very other simple questions. Do you have a view on the discoveries of oil in Turkana and what it means for your institution there? And finally,
3, please.
okay, I'll
Yeah,
leave the
let's
last
stick with
one,
those
sorry.
2. Thank you.
Well, I think the discovery of oil in Kenya is fortuitous. I think the people who discovered it and are working on it are very responsible as an oil company so far. They've worked extremely closely within the parameters that the government have set and the people believe is important. Tullow Oil, who's the company, I think have set the bar very high for oil exploration. Oil very seldom brings nothing but pleasure, but I think overall the country needs oil if we're going to deal with our development needs and our debt needs, and I think we should try not to be Nigeria but Denmark, and it's distance between the two, but we have the advantage of being able to look at history and make choices based on that. In terms of where we're going as a species, I haven't the slightest notion, but we're not evolving in the way these early hominids did. We're subjecting ourselves to change more in our behavior and our culture and that sort of adaptation. There may be minor changes in specific corners of the world, but I don't think we're going to evolve any further in the sense that we've been talking about.
And the primates, the chimp couldn't evolve anymore, just very quickly, for instance?
I'm absolutely certain they couldn't, and I'm sure, knowing what they probably now know, they wouldn't.
We're not going to get a Planet of the Apes scenario, thank you, yes. Can I just see the hands very quickly? So it's 1, 2, 3. If you're very quick, I'll take all 3 and then that's it. Yep.
Yeah.
It does help if you stand, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Hi there. I know Lewis favoured a bushy lineage and advocated hybridization. With all the revolution of DNA testing upon paleoanthropology, I was wondering what's been your greatest shock or surprise and why?
Okay, thank you. I'll take 2 or 3 in one. Your greatest shock and surprise, and then we'll finish. Yes, the microphone. Who's got it? Somebody got it this side? Ushers, if you could give it to the people, unless you wish to ask a question yourself. Yes. Briefly. Yeah, if you've got the mic, just stand, because we're running short of time.
Hi. Just a quick question. I seem to remember having read somewhere that all non-African people existing today have 1 to 4% of Neanderthal genomes. So could you just shed a little bit of light on how modern man led to the extinction of Neanderthals and how sort of interbreeding with Neanderthals led to our having 1 to 4% of genomes today?
Thank you. We got that. Yep. There, and then the final one there.
It's no debate that poaching is a big crisis around the world. And there's a lot of debate recently in conservation that legalizing the trade in ivory and rhino horn could flood the market and actually decrease poaching. And I was just wondering your opinions on that.
Yeah. The final one, was it at the back?
He asked the same thing.
Fine. That's it. Okay, so we'll take the surprise and shock at the end, but do you want to pick up the poaching one and then about the Neanderthal still existing in some people outside of Africa?
Well, I've heard the argument that if you legalize the sale of ivory, it'll bring the situation back to control. There's not a shred of evidence that that's likely to happen. And back in 1969, we destroyed ivory, much to the, well, it wasn't 69, it was 89, destroyed ivory 12 tons, much to the shock and horror of the world. Everyone said the price will shoot up. At the time we did it, ivory was selling in Kenya on the black market for $150 a pound. Within 3 months, it's selling for $5 a pound, and it remained there for at least 10 years. Then people further south on the continent got permission to sell stockpiled ivory, sold it at a very low price, but the demand for ivory started again, and today ivory is selling for $300 a pound. Ivory's on the market again. I think there should be no trade in ivory now or at any time in the future. I think it needs to be a non-issue.
And then there was is there any residual Neanderthal in people outside Africa, said the chap.
Well, I think the residual Neanderthal until recently was largely confined to non-Africans. A very small percentage, but the geneticists are constantly changing their position on exactly what the significance of this is. And at the moment, I don't think we need to get too excited about it, except to use it when trying to insult non-Africans and say with some scientific basis, you are just a Neanderthal. That's quite an effective epithet. But how valuable it would be, I don't know. I think we got preoccupied with Neanderthal in the last 50 years. My good friend Chris Stringer has spent a lot of his life studying it. There will be a chance in the next few days to discuss this in detail. But we don't seem to have any Neanderthals in the fossil record in Africa, but we have fossils that were around during the same period that Neanderthal was. And I think if the African fossils had been discovered in the quantity we now have, perhaps Neanderthal wouldn't have taken on the significance it did when it was first discovered and discussed as the best European primitive ancestor. So I think one of the difficulties of paleoanthropology is the sequence of discovery and the difficulty of hindsight. It doesn't always make it easier to remember what we said before. But I think it's a forward-moving progression. And we have gone from a point where we weren't sure that we've evolved or that it was Africa to we're absolutely certain it was Africa, and many important events took place that gave rise to us. Exactly which and what is particularly significant is the work of places like the Turkana Basin Institute, the Max Planck, Cambridge, Harvard. There are countless groups now working on these questions, and that's where the answers are going to come from.
And then the final question from the audience was, in your long career, were there any shocks or surprises something that you came across that either shocked or surprised you?
I suppose the biggest surprise for me was the idea that we are all from a fairly limited genetic population 70,000 years ago. That I was not expecting because of earlier fossils that we had found. I believe it's likely to be the case, whether it's 70, 75. But yes, that surprised me that we are all so recent. Because I don't understand, if we are all so recent, why those lazy somethings that were around 200,000 years left it so long to become us. But I'm also very grateful that they didn't become us any sooner, because we wouldn't be here now. We would have destroyed the planet. So I guess there's a silver lining to all of these things.
Richard Leakey. Dr. Richard Leakey, thank you so much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure, really, to have conducted this conversation with a wonderful man who is full of compassion, who has really stuck to his principles, as you have, Richard, all your life, a great campaigner for political justice in Africa, and has really, really suffered for standing up for his principles and standing up for the rights of Africans. You are entitled to that. It's been my pleasure, and thank you all very much for being with us. Last word.
Last word is, I think she gets an A+.